architect's confidence. I'd promised her transformation, the kind that only comes from sleeping under aspens and waking to frost patterns that look like neural pathways spreading across tent fabric. What I didn't promise, what I couldn't have known to promise, was that we'd be mapping something far older than any geological survey. The afternoon light came sideways through the lodgepole pines, turning everything amber and ancient. I'd led her 4 miles in, following a route I'd memorized so thoroughly, it had become muscle memory. West Fork drainage, across the meadow where elk bones surfaced every spring, like archaeological discoveries, then up into the saddle where the old trail met the new. Except the bones were there wrong. They'd always been scattered, picked clean by seasons and scavengers, but now they formed a line. Perfect, deliberate, pointing deeper into the valley. My fiancée noticed my hesitation. She didn't ask why I'd stopped, and I appreciated that about her, the way she trusted the pauses as much as the motion. Instead, she tilted her head, listening, and that's when I realized what had changed. The forest had gone completely silent. Not the comfortable quiet of dusk approaching, but an absolute absence of sound that felt almost textured, like pressing your hands against velvet in a dark room. No birds, no insects, not even the whisper of wind through the pines, though I could see the highest branches swaying. The silence had weight to it, had presence, and I caught myself holding my breath as if afraid to disturb something watching us decide which way to go. I pulled out my compass. The needle swung lazily, couldn't seem to settle. North became northeast, became north by northwest in slow, drunken circles. I tapped the housing, checked for metal interference, told myself it was a cheap knockoff even though I'd bought it from the same outfitter that supplied search and rescue. The needle kept wandering. That's when I saw the first marks. They were cut deep into an aspen trunk about 20 yards ahead, 3 parallel gouges running vertically down the white bark. The spacing suggested claws, except they started 11, maybe 12 feet up. I'd seen plenty of bear sign in these mountains. Trees stripped of bark, territorial markings, the occasional claw punctures. But bears, even grizzlies standing on hind legs, couldn't reach that high. And these marks weren't the ragged tears of an animal marking territory. They were too precise, too measured, like someone had taken calipers to the tree and calculated the exact spacing needed to suggest something familiar while being fundamentally wrong. I didn't mention them. Instead, I suggested we take the lower trail, the one that wound through denser forest where the canopy would provide better shelter if weather moved in. She agreed without question, and I hated myself for the lie. There was no weather coming. The sky held that crystalline October clarity that promised cold, but not storms. I wanted the lower trail because it meant we'd reach the valley floor faster, could set camp while we still had light, could zip ourselves into synthetic safety before whatever had marked that tree decided to mark something else. We moved quickly, too quickly for a first-time backpacker, but she kept pace without complaint. Every 100 yards or so, I'd spot another set of marks, always high, always 3 parallel gouges, and always positioned where they'd catch my eye just as I thought we'd left them behind, like breadcrumbs leading us deeper into a story I hadn't agreed to read. The sun dropped behind the western peaks, and the temperature followed it down. My breath began to plume. So did hers, and I watched the vapor curl from her lips with a kind of desperate focus, needing to see proof that we were still fully present, still exhaling carbon dioxide and certainty into air that suddenly felt less like atmosphere and more like observation. We made camp in a sheltered valley where a creek bent around a small clearing. The spot was perfect. Flat ground, water source, natural windbreak from the surrounding pines. Too perfect. The kind of perfect that makes you check your surroundings twice, that makes you wonder why such an ideal site isn't marked on any map, isn't circled in any trail guide. But my legs ached and her face had gone gray with exhaustion, so I pushed the unease down and started unpacking. She built the fire while I set up the tent. We moved in practiced tandem, the kind of coordination that comes from planning a life together, from negotiating who does dishes and who handles finances. Domestic choreography translated to wilderness survival. Except I kept catching myself counting trees, kept losing track of which trunk I'd just looked at, because they all seemed to shift position when I wasn't watching directly. We ate freeze-dried lasagna that tasted like salted cardboard and regret. She asked me about the marks on the trees, her voice carefully casual, the way you ask about strange noises in a new house. I told her it was probably just bear activity, unusual height but not unprecedented. She nodded, spooned another bite, didn't mention that I'd been avoiding eye contact since we'd made camp. The fire popped and sent sparks spiraling into darkness that seemed to press closer with each passing minute. Around 9, we retreated to the tent. I arranged our bear spray, my emergency whistle, and a small bell I normally used for warning wildlife of our presence. She watched me create this arsenal without comment, then wrapped herself in her sleeping bag and closed her eyes. Within minutes, her breathing deepened into something like sleep, though I noticed her hands stayed clenched even as her face relaxed. I lay awake, listening. The silence had followed us. It pooled around the tent like water, heavy and cold, and utterly devoid of the usual nighttime chorus. No owls, no rodents rustling through undergrowth. Not even the creek made sound, though I could hear, or thought I could hear, something else. A low-frequency hum, just at the edge of perception, like standing too close to high-voltage lines or pressing your ear against your own pulse. Around 2 in the morning, something began circling our tent. I heard it first as a change in air pressure, the way your ears pop when weather shifts suddenly. Then came the footsteps, if they were footsteps. They moved with disturbing regularity, keeping perfect distance from our shelter, never varying their rhythm. Heavy enough to compress the forest floor, but with a quality that suggested weight without corresponding mass, like watching someone mime walking downstairs. My hand found the bear spray. The other reached for the bell. I rang it once, sharp and clear. The sound cut through the silence like a scalpel through skin. Something answered, not with a growl or a vocalization, but with a sharp crack of breaking wood, the sound of a green branch being snapped deliberately. It came from the direction the footsteps had just passed, which meant whatever had been circling had stopped, had turned toward us, had responded. I rang the bell again. Another crack, this time closer. Then another, moving in a circle that tightened with each response, each one answering my bell with precise timing. Like we were having a conversation I didn't remember starting. My fiancée woke. She didn't sit up, didn't speak, just opened her eyes and stared at the tent's ceiling. Her breathing stayed deep and steady, but her pupils had dilated so wide her eyes looked black. I wanted to tell her to stay calm, wanted to explain that we were safe, that bear spray worked on any animal, that my experience would protect us. But I'd stopped believing my own expertise sometime between the 11th and 12th crack of breaking wood. The circling continued for hours, not constantly. It would stop for long stretches, 10 or 15 minutes of that pressing silence, and then resume with renewed purpose. Each time it stopped, I prayed it had left. Each time it started again, I felt something inside me constrict a little tighter, some fundamental belief in the logical world being slowly wrung out like water from cloth. Around 4, something pushed against the tent's rainfly, not a brush or a bump, but a deliberate, exploratory pressure that traveled the length of the tent wall, as if whatever was outside was running its hand, or something hand-shaped, along the fabric. Testing. Measuring. The pressure was firm enough to bend the tent poles slightly inward, to make the nylon creak with tension. It moved with terrible purpose, starting at the head of the tent and working methodically toward the foot, and I realized with dawning horror that it was tracing our shapes, learning our dimensions, mapping us. I lay perfectly still, bear spray forgotten, bell silent in my hand. My fiancée had stopped breathing entirely, or so it seemed. Her chest barely moved, her eyes fixed on the tent ceiling where the fabric pressed inward, outward, following the curve of some invisible examination. I wanted to shout, to make noise, to break whatever spell we'd fallen under. But some deeper instinct kept me frozen, kept me silent because movement felt like permission, like acknowledgement, like opening a door I desperately needed to keep locked. The pressure traveled the entire length of the tent, reached the foot, paused. Then it reversed, slower this time, more careful, as if committing every detail to memory. When it finally withdrew, the relief was almost worse than the violation, because now I knew something had stood inches from us, separated only by a few millimeters of ripstop nylon, and had chosen not to enter. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, like it didn't want to reveal what the night had hidden. I crawled from the tent into air that felt scoured, scrubbed clean of everything except cold and weak sunlight, filtering through high clouds that hadn't been in yesterday's forecast. The first thing I saw was the stones. They'd been arranged in a perfect rectangle, roughly 6 feet by 3 feet, positioned about 10 feet from our tent. But it wasn't until I stood and looked down at them that I understood what I was seeing. The stones formed an outline, our outline, mine and hers, lying side by side, recreated in granite and quartzite with disturbing accuracy. The curve of shoulders, the angle of feet, even the space between our bodies where cold air had settled during the night. It was a map, a diagram, a blueprint of us sleeping, rendered in stone with the kind of precision that suggested careful observation, intimate knowledge, patient documentation. My fiancée emerged from the tent, saw the stones, and made a sound I'd never heard from her before. Not quite a gasp, not quite a sob, something caught between recognition and rejection. I wanted to tell her it was a coincidence, that wind or animals or geological accident had arranged rocks into that particular pattern. But the lie wouldn't form. The stones had been placed, deliberately, by something that had studied us through fabric and darkness and had wanted us to know we'd been measured. We broke camp in silence. Neither of us spoke about the stones, though we both kept glancing at them as we packed, kept checking to make sure they weren't rearranging themselves while we worked. The temperature had dropped further. My thermometer read 28 degrees, cold enough that our breath crystallized instantly, hung in the air like speech bubbles that never filled with words. I checked my compass. The needle spun freely now, making full rotations without any pretense of finding north. I put it away, relied on my knowledge of the terrain, on muscle memory and sun position. We'd retrace our route out. Simple. Direct. We'd be at the trailhead by noon. That's when I saw the tracks. They started at the edge of our clearing and led deeper into the valley. Not toward the trail out, but away from it, into terrain that wasn't on any map I'd memorized. Each print was massive, easily 18 inches long, shaped vaguely like a human footprint, but wrong in ways I couldn't immediately articulate. Too narrow at the heel, too wide at the toes. The stride length suggested something either impossibly tall or moving with a gait that didn't correspond to bipedal locomotion. There were dozens of them, all pointed into the valley, none coming back out. I knelt beside one, trying to identify it, to force it into some category I could name and therefore control. The depth suggested tremendous weight, but the edges were too clean, too sharp, like they'd been pressed into the ground rather than walked. I touched the edge of one print, felt the disturbed earth, and my hand came away with something like static electricity, a tingling sensation that traveled up my arm and lodged somewhere behind my sternum. My fiancée pulled at my sleeve. Her eyes asked the question her mouth couldn't form. What made these? I had no answer, or rather, I had dozens of answers, each one more impossible than the last. So I told her we were leaving. Now, we'd take the trail out at double time, wouldn't stop until we reached the ranger station, would report anomalous wildlife activity, and recommend the trail be temporarily closed for safety assessment. We hiked fast, almost running. The morning sun felt thin, inadequate, like it couldn't quite penetrate to ground level. I kept checking behind us, kept scanning the forest for movement, but saw only trees standing in that peculiar stillness that suggested held breath. My compass stayed useless, spinning in lazy circles whenever I checked it, which I did compulsively, every few minutes, like checking a wound to see if it's still bleeding. 3 hours later, we reached the trailhead. My truck sat exactly where I'd left it, covered in frost that had formed patterns I didn't want to examine too closely. We threw our gear in the bed, climbed into the cab, and I started the engine with shaking hands. The radio came on automatically, some country station playing songs about lost love and found faith, and the normalcy of it nearly broke me. She spoke for the first time since leaving camp. her voice rough from disuse and cold. What do we tell them? I looked at her, really looked. Saw the exhaustion, the confusion, the dawning awareness that we'd both experienced something that had no place in our shared reality. Saw the question underneath her question. Are we going to pretend this didn't happen? Bare activity, I said. Just bare activity. She nodded. We drove to the ranger station in silence, filed our backcountry report, and I wrote exactly what I'd planned to write. Encountered unusual bear sign on October 12th. Recommend trail assessment. The ranger, a kid barely out of college with a name tag that read Jensen, thanked us for our diligence and noted the report in his computer. He asked if we'd felt unsafe at any point. I said no. He asked if we'd seen any actual bears. I said no. He asked if we'd like to recommend any trail improvements. I said no. We walked out into afternoon sunlight that felt like a different universe from the one we'd left 24 hours earlier. She held my hand. Hers was cold, or maybe mine was, or maybe we'd both carried something back from those mountains that would never quite warm up. I drove us home. We unpacked in silence. That night we lay in our own bed, sheets that smelled like detergent and civilization, and didn't speak about what we'd seen. Didn't speak about the stones or the tracks, or the thing that had measured our shapes through synthetic fabric. After a while, she fell asleep. I didn't, because I kept thinking about those tracks, about how they'd all pointed into the valley, away from any known trail, away from any mapped territory, about how none of them had led back out. And I kept thinking about the stones, that perfect outline of our sleeping bodies, rendered with such meticulous accuracy that whoever, whatever, had placed them must have known exactly how we looked from above, must have been watching us from some elevated position, must have been documenting us with the kind of care reserved for specimens, for maps. 3 weeks have passed. We haven't discussed going back, haven't discussed much of anything, really, except in the careful, curated language people use when they're trying to forget something together. She started sleeping with the lights on. I've started checking our windows before bed, making sure the curtains are fully closed, that there are no gaps where something might look through and study the shape of us sleeping. Last night, I woke at 2 a.m. to find her standing at the bedroom window, staring out at our backyard. I asked her what she was looking at. She didn't turn around, just kept staring, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried that same quality of controlled terror I'd heard in the tent. There are stones, she said, arranged in patterns, like a path, leading from the woods to our house. I got up, looked where she was looking, saw nothing but grass and darkness and the ordinary geometry of suburban safety, told her she was dreaming, still half asleep, that there was nothing there. She nodded, came back to bed, but I saw her hands shaking as she pulled the blankets up, saw the way she positioned herself so she could keep one eye on the window, and I wondered if she'd actually been dreaming, or if she'd seen something I couldn't, or wouldn't. This morning, I went outside to check the backyard, found nothing unusual, no stones, no tracks, just wet grass and fallen leaves and the residue of frost that would melt by noon. I stood there for a long time, staring at the tree line where our property met the woods, and I tried to convince myself that we'd left it all behind in the Tetons, that whatever had measured us, whatever had mapped us, whatever had watched us through darkness and fabric and fear, it had stayed in those mountains, in that valley, in that silence that still sometimes fills my ears when I'm trying to fall asleep. But my compass, the one I'd used in the Tetons, the one that had spun uselessly through our entire ordeal, sits on my desk now. I check it sometimes, when I'm alone, when the house is quiet and she's at work, and there's no one to see me indulge this particular paranoia. The needle doesn't point north anymore. It points toward our bedroom, and every night, it seems to have moved a few degrees closer. Story 2. My grandfather used to tell me stories in 2 languages, his Yupik words flowing like dark water between the English ones I'd learned in school. He'd sit by the wood stove in his cabin outside Bethel, whittling birch branches into fishing lures, and talk about the Chiliamta Aput, The stick men who walked between the willows when the wind blew just right. He never called them spirits or demons. Just men. Men made of old wood and bad intentions, who knew your name before you knew theirs. I was 7 when he first warned me. We'd been checking his fish wheel on the Kuskokwim, and he stopped mid-step on the riverbank, his weathered hand gripping my shoulder hard enough to hurt. The willows along the water were thrashing in a wind I couldn't feel, and through their motion came a sound like dry fingers snapping, like someone shuffling a deck of old bones. He told me then, if the willows ever call your name, your real name, the one only family knows, you walk toward water, not toward the voice. Water runs one direction. Voices can come from anywhere. I thought about those words every time I visited him, right up until the stroke took his speech away 2 winters ago. He'd try to tell me something in those final weeks, his mouth working around sounds that wouldn't form, his eyes tracking something in the corner of the room that I couldn't see. The hospice nurse said it was common, this looking at nothing. The morphine played tricks, but I knew what he was seeing. The job posting for the wetland monitoring project in Fairbanks came through in March, just as the breakup started. I needed the work, needed the distraction more than the money, if I'm honest. And the Bureau of Land Management wasn't asking questions about why a guy with my credentials was willing to spend 2 months alone in the backcountry installing sensors in permafrost bogs. They just wanted someone who could handle the cold, the isolation, and the mosquitoes. Someone who wouldn't quit after the first week of sleeping in a tent, with only the wind for company. I told myself it would be different. Fairbanks was interior Alaska, not the coastal tundra where my grandfather's people came from. Different tribes, different stories, different spirits. The willows grew here too, salix species, the same slender branches and silver-green leaves. But they weren't the same willows. That's what I told myself. The site was designated on my map as Sector 7, a braided stream complex about 30 miles southeast of the city, accessible only by bush plane or a brutal ATV ride through terrain that would swallow you whole if you lost the trail. I chose the plane. The pilot who dropped me off on a gravel bar was a grizzled woman named Dina, who'd been flying the interior for 30 years. She helped me unload the cases of equipment, the solar panels, the weather-resistant housing for the data loggers. She looked at the tree line where the black spruce gave way to willow thickets and made a sound in her throat. Not quite disapproval, more like recognition. "You Yupik?" she asked. "Half," I said, "on my mother's side." She nodded slowly, her eyes still on the willows. "You know the stories then?" "I know them." "Good." She climbed back into the cockpit. "Radio check every 48 hours. Missed 2 calls. I come get you whether you want it or not." The plane's engine drowned out whatever else she might have said, and then I was alone with 60 pounds of equipment and 3 weeks of food, standing on a gravel bar in the kind of silence that isn't really silent at all. The first 3 days were routine. I established my base camp on high ground, upwind from the boggy sections where the sensors needed to go. The work was methodical. Drill into the permafrost, install the thermistors at varying depths, connect them to the data logger, secure everything against weather and wildlife. By the time I started on the willow sections, I'd settled into the rhythm of it, the physical exhaustion that made sleep come easy, despite the midnight sun hanging in the sky like a watching eye. The willows grew densest along the stream channels, their roots anchored in the perennially frozen ground, their branches reaching up in tangled profusion. To get the sensors placed correctly, I had to wade through thickets where the stems grew so close together they formed living walls. The work was slow, claustrophobic. I'd mark my path with numbered stakes, bright orange flags on 4-foot poles, so I could find my way back to the equipment cases for batteries and cables. On the 4th day, I installed stakes 1 through 12 in a rough line from the edge of the willow thicket to a clearing about 200 yards in. The clearing was eerily perfect, a circle of bare ground where nothing grew, surrounded by willows so dense they formed an almost solid barrier. I made a note in my field book: investigate soil composition, possible contamination or pH anomaly. Then I marked the clearing's center with stake 13 and headed back to camp as the afternoon wind picked up. That was when I first heard the sound. It came from deep in the willows to my left, a dry, rattling percussion, like someone shaking a bundle of hollow reeds, or like someone walking through dead branches. The rational part of my brain cataloged it automatically. Wind through dry wood, nothing more. But the sound had rhythm, pattern. It rose and fell in a cadence that felt deliberate, and beneath it ran a softer noise, almost like whispering. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. The silence that followed had weight to it, a pressure against my eardrums that made me want to swallow, to equalize something that couldn't be equalized. I could feel my pulse in my throat, in my fingertips. The willows around me stood motionless despite the wind I could hear moving through the spruce canopy above. Then my grandfather's voice spoke my middle name. Not his exact voice, not his living voice, with its rough edges and the way he'd roll certain consonants in the back of his throat. This was thinner, drier, like an audio recording played through old speakers. But it was him. The pronunciation, the inflection, the specific way he'd always emphasized the second syllable when he was serious, when he wanted my attention. My legs carried me forward without conscious thought, away from the sound, toward the creek I could hear burbling somewhere ahead. I didn't run. Running in the backcountry is how people break ankles and die of exposure. But I walked fast, my breath coming hard, my eyes scanning for the orange flags of my stake line. Stake 12, stake 11. The numbers counted down as I retraced my path, and the rational part of my brain was already constructing explanations. Auditory pareidolia, the tendency of the human brain to find patterns in random noise. Stress, lack of sleep. The memory of my grandfather so fresh that of course I'd imagine his voice in the wind. But when I reached stake 8, my hands started shaking. The stake had been moved. Not fallen. Moved. It stood upright, firmly planted, the orange flag snapping in a breeze I still couldn't feel on my skin. But it was 20 feet off the line, positioned at the edge of a narrow gap between two willow clumps, an opening I didn't remember seeing before. Stakes 7 and 6 had been moved too. They formed a path now, a corridor leading away from my original line, deeper into the thicket, toward the clearing I'd marked with stake 13. I stood there for what might have been 30 seconds or 30 minutes, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. I'd planted those stakes myself less than 4 hours ago. I'd driven them into the frozen ground with a rubber mallet, checked their alignment with my GPS unit. They'd been exactly where they needed to be. The wind picked up. The willows around me began to sway, and that rattling sound started again, closer now, coming from multiple directions. And underneath it, woven through it like a secondary melody, came the whispers. They were saying my name, both names. The English one I used for work, for official documents, for the world outside my grandfather's cabin, and the Yupik one, the one my mother had chosen, the one I'd never told anyone here. I ran. Forget the backcountry safety rules, forget the careful navigation, forget everything except the animal knowledge that when something knows your true name and you didn't tell them, you run. The willows blurred past me, branches whipping at my face and arms, the ground uneven and treacherous under my boots. I could hear the rattling behind me now, and beside me, and ahead of me, multiplying, surrounding, a percussion section from a nightmare orchestra. The voices came from everywhere and nowhere. They overlapped, creating harmonics that shouldn't exist in nature, frequencies that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. I stumbled, caught myself on a willow stem that felt wrong under my palm, too warm, too yielding, almost like skin over bone. I snatched my hand back and kept moving, trying to orient myself by memory, by instinct, by anything except the sounds that were definitely, absolutely guiding me in circles. The sun was still up but lower now, casting long shadows through the thicket, and the shadows moved wrong, jerking and stuttering like footage with frames missing. My grandfather's voice rose above the others, clearer now, speaking in Yupik, words I only half remembered, from bedtime stories and warnings, from prayers he'd whisper when the wind blew too hard against the cabin walls. He was telling me something important. He was trying to warn me. or he was trying to lead me somewhere I shouldn't go. Water runs one direction. The thought cut through my panic like a blade. I stopped, chest heaving, and listened past the voices, past the rattling willows, past my own ragged breathing. There, faint but steady, the sound of running water. Not the whisper hiss of wind through branches, but the actual gurgle and splash of a stream over rocks. I turned toward it, away from the clearest voice, away from what sounded like my grandfather calling me home. The willows fought me, branches catching at my clothes and hair, roots grabbing at my boots. The rattling intensified, became almost frantic, and for just a moment I saw something in my peripheral vision, a shape among the stems, tall and impossibly thin, assembled from branches and bad intentions, with gaps where joints should be and hollow spaces where a face might form. I didn't look directly at it. I kept my eyes on the ground ahead, on my boots, on the water sound that grew louder with each step. The willows thinned, the ground firmed up, and then I was stumbling out onto a gravel bar I recognized, the creek running fast and cold just a few feet away, flowing northwest toward the Tanana River. The voices stopped. The wind died. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own gasping breaths, the hammer of my heart, the neutral commentary of the creek doing what water always does, running downhill, one direction, following the laws of physics that don't change when you're terrified. I followed it downstream for 2 miles before I felt safe enough to cut back toward my base camp. The sun hung in the sky like it always did, indifferent to my terror. By the time I reached my tent, I'd almost convinced myself I'd panicked over nothing. Heat exhaustion, maybe. Dehydration. A bad reaction to the energy bars I'd been living on. Almost. I radioed Dina that night and told her everything was fine. The lie came easily. What was I going to say? That my dead grandfather's voice had called me into the willows, that something had moved my survey stakes. She'd have pulled me out, marked me down as another case of bush fever, another city worker who couldn't hack the isolation. Instead, I said the installation was going well, that I'd have the sensors fully deployed within a week. She acknowledged and signed off, and I sat in my tent listening to the wind move through the spruce forest, waiting for it to reach the willows. When it did, I heard nothing. Just wind. Just trees. I told myself I'd imagine the rest. The next morning, I forced myself to go back to the site. The sensors needed data verification, and I had 3 weeks of work left on my contract. I couldn't afford to fail, couldn't afford the questions that would come if I abandoned the project. And part of me, the stubborn part, the part that had spent too many years proving I could handle anything Alaska threw at me, refused to be chased off by voices in the wind. The survey stakes were exactly where I'd left them the day before. Not where I'd planted them originally, but where they'd been moved to, forming that corridor through the willows leading to the clearing. I stared at them for a long time, my GPS unit in hand, comparing coordinates to my field notes. The discrepancy was undeniable. These stakes were not where I'd put them, but they were also exactly where they'd been when I ran. They hadn't moved back. They hadn't been disturbed further. They were waiting. I gathered my equipment, the sensors I hadn't installed, the solar panels, the cables, and mounting hardware. It took me 6 hours to collect everything from that sector, working in complete silence, my eyes tracking every movement in my peripheral vision, my ears straining for any sound that wasn't natural. The willows stood still. The clearing, when I finally reached it, was empty except for stake 13, standing exactly where I'd planted it. In the bare dirt around the stake, I saw footprints, not boot prints, not animal tracks. These were narrow impressions, like someone walking on stilts, or like the marks a bundle of bound sticks might make if it learned to walk. They circled the stake in a spiral pattern that tightened toward the center, then led away into the thicket, toward deeper darkness where the willows grew so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in. I left the stake there, left all of them, carried my equipment back to base camp, broke down my tent, and packed everything I could carry into my backpack. The rest I cached under a tarp marked on my GPS. Dina wasn't scheduled to pick me up for another 2 weeks, but I hiked to the nearest accessible gravel bar and camped there, within sight of the river. where I could see anything approaching from miles away. When she finally came for me, right on schedule, she took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. We loaded my gear in silence. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the willow thickets, at the braided streams and the clearing I'd marked with stake 13. The clearing wasn't empty. There were shapes there, dozens of them, tall and thin and absolutely still, arranged in a circle like they were waiting for something, or like they'd finished waiting, and whatever they'd wanted to happen had already happened. The lab analysis of my soil samples came back 3 weeks later. Everything was normal, except for the pollen counts. According to the report, I'd collected samples containing pollen from Salix lanata, Arctic woolly willow, a species that grows in coastal Alaska in the tundra regions where my grandfather's people lived. It doesn't grow in the interior, not naturally, not this far south. The environmental scientist who processed my samples called it contamination, probable field mixing of specimens. She suggested I be more careful about cleaning my tools between sites. I thanked her and hung up, staring at the bright orange survey flags I'd kept from the project, now leaning in the corner of my apartment. They'd been with me in Fairbanks. They'd never been to the coast, but the pollen had. Or the pollen knew where I was from. Knew what would grow in the place my grandfather used to tell his stories, where the willows along the Kuskokwim spoke names in the wind, and men made of old wood walked when the weather turned strange. Last week, the wind shifted here in town. It came from the north, carrying the scent of autumn and changes I couldn't name. And in that wind, moving through the ornamental willows planted along the walking trail near my building, I heard something. Not words. Not yet. But a rattling. A rhythm. The beginning of a pattern that might, if I listened long enough, resolve itself into speech. I went inside, closed the windows, turned on music loud enough to drown out the wind. But at night, when the building is quiet and the breeze picks up, I still hear it sometimes. My middle name, spoken in my grandfather's voice, or in something using his voice, calling from somewhere I can't see, inviting me to come back, to finish the work I started, to step into that clearing and learn what the willow men wanted to show me. My grandfather told me once that some doors, once opened, never fully close. That some names, once heard in the wrong place, create a connection that distance can't break. I don't go near willows anymore, not if I can help it. But they know where I live. And sometimes, when the wind is right, I think I see them at the edge of my vision. Tall, thin shapes assembled from shadows and branches, standing patient in the gaps between streetlights, waiting for me to stop running toward water, to turn around and finally answer when they call my name. Story 3. The irrigation bridge shouldn't have existed at all. Not on any county map. Not in any official record. My friend found it mentioned in a thread on some paranormal forum, buried under 3 pages of the usual nonsense about UFOs and government conspiracies. But there was something about the way the original poster described it that caught his attention. Motors fail at midnight, always midnight, and the water sounds wrong. We'd been friends since college, bonded over late-night drives and an appetite for the unexplained that never quite matured into adulthood, along with the rest of us. He worked IT now. I sold insurance. Both of us had mortgages and responsibilities and that quiet, grinding awareness that we were getting older without getting anywhere interesting. So when he showed me the post over beers one Thursday, I didn't need much convincing. The bridge was on tribal land, technically off limits without permission, but the forum post included coordinates and the assurance that nobody bothered to patrol it anymore. Something about budget cuts and jurisdictional disputes. The structure itself was a relic from the 30s, built to redirect creek water during the Dust Bowl years, and supposedly abandoned when the irrigation projects shifted to modern pump systems. But locals claimed it was something else, that the tribe had specifically asked for it to be left alone, unmaintained, slowly returning to the earth. We left on a Saturday, my V6 humming along Highway 47, as afternoon bled into dusk. My friend rode shotgun, scrolling through his phone for any additional information he could find, muttering fragments of half-formed theories. The reservation boundary came up suddenly, marked by a hand-painted sign and a dirt road that split off from the asphalt like a scar. The transition was immediate and unsettling. Paved road became hardpack and gravel, and the landscape seemed to fold inward, trees pressing closer on both sides. My headlights caught dust motes that hung suspended in the air with unnatural stillness, and the usual highway sounds, the white noise of other traffic, the distant rumble of civilization, cut off completely. We might have been driving into a pocket dimension, sealed away from everything familiar. Neither of us spoke much during that last stretch. The silence felt deliberate, like something we shouldn't disturb. My friend eventually lowered his phone, the screen's glow the only light besides my dashboard, and stared out the windshield with an expression I couldn't quite read. The bridge appeared around a bend, and I eased off the gas without thinking. It was smaller than I'd expected, a narrow span of weathered concrete and rusted rebar that stretched maybe 30 feet across a channel cut deep into the earth. Water moved below, catching moonlight in brief, silvered flashes, but the sound of it, the rush and tumble you'd expect, was absent. Or not absent exactly, muffled, like someone had thrown a blanket over the entire creek. I pulled onto the bridge's approach, concrete cracked and sprouting weeds through every fissure, and checked my watch. 11:42. We'd timed it right, if timing mattered, if any of this was real. The engine ticked as it cooled, and we sat there, two grown men in a pickup truck, waiting for midnight like teenagers at a cemetery gate. My friend suggested we get out, stretch our legs, maybe walk the bridge's length to get a better look at the water. I agreed, though something in my gut twisted at the idea. Outside, the air tasted metallic and old. The bridge's surface was worse than it looked from inside the cab, pitted and stained, with gaps where whole sections had crumbled away. I could see down into the channel, maybe 15 feet to where the water moved with that same wrong, muted quality. The creek bed itself seemed wider than the water flow warranted, like something had carved out extra space and left it empty. My friend walked ahead, his phone's flashlight beam cutting weak paths through the darkness. He stopped at the bridge's center, looking down, and I heard him say something about the current being unusual, too fast in some places, too slow in others, following no pattern that made sense. I joined him, peering over the edge, and that's when I noticed the smell. Wet earth and rust, but underneath it something else. Something organic and wrong, like meat left too long in a warm place. I mentioned it to my friend, and he nodded slowly, his face pale in the phone's reflected glow. We walked back to the truck, and I checked my watch again. 11:56. The last 4 minutes stretched like hours. We sat with the doors locked, windows cracked just enough to let in air, and waited. My friend tried to make conversation, nervous rambling about the forum post and what we might actually witness, but his voice sounded thin and unconvincing. I kept my eyes on the dashboard clock, watching the digital numbers crawl forward. 11:59. Midnight. Nothing happened. The engine kept its low, idle rumble. The dashboard lights stayed bright, and the world outside remained exactly as it was. My friend laughed, a quick burst of relief, and reached for the door handle. He suggested we'd been worked up over nothing, that we should... The engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, just stopped, mid-cycle, like someone had reached into the hood and yanked out a vital piece. The dashboard light stayed on, glowing steady and impossible, but the ignition was completely dead. I turned the key, felt it click uselessly, tried again. Nothing. My friend's laugh cut off. Outside, the silence deepened into something physical, a pressure against my eardrums. The water below had stopped making even its muted sound. Total absence, like the creek had frozen mid-flow. That's when I saw it. At the very edge of my headlight's reach, something moved. Low to the ground, four-legged, emerging from the brush on the far side of the bridge. At first, I thought it was a dog, maybe a stray or someone's lost pet, but as it limped into better light, dragging one hind leg behind it, I realized how wrong that assumption was. The thing had no hair, Its skin was gray-pink and loose, hanging in folds around its skeletal frame. The head was too large, the snout too short, and when it turned toward us, I saw that its eyes caught the light wrong. Not the reflective gleam you'd expect from an animal, but something flat and absorptive, like staring into dead screens. My friend whispered something I didn't catch. The creature, I couldn't think of it as a dog anymore, stood at the bridge's entrance, swaying slightly, its breathing visible as condensation in the cool air. But the rhythm was off, too slow, each exhale lasting far longer than it should. I did something stupid. Some primitive part of my brain decided that making noise would help, would scare it off, or break whatever spell had settled over the bridge. I hit the horn. The blast echoed across the empty landscape, harsh and immediate. And the creature reacted. It rose. Not stood up, rose. Its spine elongated impossibly, vertebrae cracking and popping as the thing stretched upward and upward, front legs extending like telescoping rods. In seconds, it had gone from slouched and dog-sized to something tall enough to look over my hood, its malformed head now level with the windshield. The loose skin pulled taut, revealing angular joints and a skeletal structure that made no anatomical sense. We didn't breathe, didn't move. The thing's flat eyes fixed on us through the glass, and I had the terrible certainty that it saw more than just two men in a truck. It saw something deeper, something vulnerable and exposed that I didn't know I was showing. The moment stretched, elastic and cruel. Then at the far end of the bridge, headlights appeared. The beams cut through the darkness, distant but approaching, and the creature's head swiveled toward them with a motion that bent at angles nothing with a spine should manage. For a heartbeat, it remained frozen in that impossible height, and I thought I saw its mouth working, lips pulling back from teeth that were too numerous and too sharp. Then it collapsed. Not fell. Collapsed, like air rushing out of a balloon. The height vanished, the spine compressed back into something approximately dog-shaped, and it scrambled away on all fours, disappearing into the brush with a rustling that sounded almost relieved. The approaching vehicle was a pickup, older than mine, with a rattling diesel engine that grew louder as it pulled alongside. I couldn't see the driver clearly through the glare of their headlights, just a silhouette that sat still for a moment before flashing their high beams twice. My friend found his voice, suggested we try the ignition. My hands shook as I turned the key, expecting nothing, but the engine caught immediately, smooth and strong like it had never died at all. The other truck didn't move, just idled there, headlights pointed at us, waiting. I put mine in reverse, backed off the bridge, and turned around on the narrow road. As we passed, I glimpsed the driver, an older man, weathered face shadowed by a baseball cap, expression neutral and knowing in a way that made my skin crawl. We drove in silence for maybe 10 minutes before the radio crackled to life. We hadn't turned it on. The static resolved briefly into something that might have been crying, high-pitched and desperate, the sound an infant makes when hungry or scared or alone. My friend lunged for the volume knob, but the crying cut off before he reached it, replaced by ordinary static that faded as quickly as it had come. He suggested we'd imagined it, stress and adrenaline playing tricks. I didn't answer, couldn't really, and because I'd been watching the road, and in that brief moment when the crying filled the cab, I'd seen something in the rearview mirror, just a flicker, easily dismissed, that looked like the creature from the bridge, standing on two legs in the middle of the road behind us, watching us leave. We didn't talk about it afterward. Not really. He sent me a few texts the following week, links to articles about mass hallucinations and infrasound causing paranoia. I sent back non-committal responses and let the conversation die. But I knew, and I think he knew, that we were just performing the ritual of rational explanation, going through the motions because admitting the alternative was impossible. I did go back once, 2 weeks later, alone, in daylight. The bridge looked harmless under afternoon sun, just old concrete and weeds. I didn't get out of the truck, didn't even slow down much, but as I passed I saw someone standing on the shoulder, a woman from the tribe, maybe 40 or 50, wearing a denim jacket and watching the road with patient expectation. She flagged me down. I stopped because refusing felt worse than whatever she might say. Her voice was kind when she spoke, gently suggesting I not return. She said the bridge had history, the kind that didn't care about intentions or curiosity. She said the water had voices and some people heard them without meaning to, without wanting to, and once you heard them, they remembered you. I asked what she meant. She just smiled, sad and knowing, and told me to drive safe, to stay on paved roads after dark, to maybe find a different hobby than looking for places like this. I took her advice. Haven't been back. Haven't even driven through that part of the state. My friend moved to Colorado 3 months later, took a job that paid less but required relocation, and we haven't spoken since beyond the occasional social media post. But sometimes late at night when sleep won't come, I think about the bridge, about the water that ran silent, about the thing that rose impossibly tall and looked at me with dead screen eyes. And I think about the woman's words, that the voices remember. Because last month, my bathroom sink started making sounds at night, just after midnight. Nothing dramatic, nothing I could record or prove. Just a faint, almost crying quality to the water as it moves through old pipes. My wife sleeps through it, says I'm imagining things, that I need to see someone about my stress levels. She's probably right. The rational part of me, the part that sells insurance and pays mortgages and lives a normal life, agrees completely. But the other part, the part that drove onto that bridge and saw something impossible, knows better. It recognizes the crying quality in the pipes. The way it sounds almost familiar, almost like something I heard before in a truck cab with static-filled speakers. The water remembers. And late at night, lying awake while my wife sleeps peacefully beside me, I wonder if I'm the one who's forgotten what I really saw, what really looked back at me from that bridge, what might have followed me home through the pipes and the wires, and all the invisible threads that connect our modern world. I wonder if forgetting is even possible, or if the voices of the water are patient, content to wait in the quiet spaces of my life, reminding me in small ways that some doors, once opened, never really close again. Story 4. The old logging trail smelled like October, wet bark and dying leaves, that sweet rot that comes before the first snow. I'd been running these woods for 3 months, ever since the transfer brought me to this corner of Michigan where the cell signal died 2 miles from anywhere that mattered. State Route 55 was my turnaround point, a strip of cracked asphalt that bisected the forest like a scar. 4 miles out, 4 miles back. Simple geometry for a simple escape. The watch on my wrist tracked everything: heart rate, pace, elevation, the precise longitude of my solitude. Technology had become my only companion since the move, since the empty house, and the empty rooms, and the particular silence that comes from having no one to break it with. The numbers didn't judge. They just measured. I was 2 miles in when the afternoon light started to fail early, filtered through the canopy into that peculiar amber that makes everything look slightly wrong, slightly staged. The trail here curved around a dense cluster of maples, their trunks thick enough that 3 men couldn't link hands around them. My breathing had found its rhythm, that meditative cadence where thought dissolves into motion. Then I saw the head. It appeared from behind the largest maple, a glimpse of something matted and dark, easily 8 feet off the ground. Too high. The thought arrived with absolute clarity, clinical and cold. No person stood that tall. The shape withdrew before my mind could process the details, leaving only an impression. Fur, or hair, something organic and wrong. I stopped. My shoes scraped against the packed dirt, scattering pebbles into the underbrush. The forest had gone quiet in that way that forests shouldn't. No birds, no insects, no rustle of small things fleeing. Just the sound of my own breath, suddenly too loud in my ears. "Hello," my voice cracked the silence like breaking glass. "Is someone there?" The response came as movement, not sound. 3 distinct impacts against the forest floor, heavy enough that I felt them through my feet. Whatever made them was parallel to the trail, matching my position but deeper in the trees. The rhythm was wrong for a deer, too measured, too deliberate. I started running again, faster now, and the sounds kept pace. Not following, accompanying, staying level with me as I pushed my speed, the footfalls maintaining their precise offset. 20 feet into the trees, I estimated, maybe 25. Close enough to track, far enough to remain unseen. My watch buzzed against my wrist, heart rate climbing. The screen showed 148 BPM, edging toward the red zone, but I didn't feel winded. I felt observed. The trail straightened out for a long stretch, giving me clear sight lines ahead and behind. Nothing. Just the narrow corridor of packed earth and the walls of trees pressing in from both sides. But the sounds continued, that steady 3-beat pattern matching my stride. Step, 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 pause. Step, 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 pause. Like a metronome set to match my panic. I tried to rationalize it. A bear, maybe, despite the season being wrong for them to be active at this time of day. A hiker staying off the trail for reasons of their own. Someone's dog, though no dog I knew moved with that weight, that intention. Each explanation felt like a lie the moment I constructed it. The forest opened up as I approached Route 55, the trees thinning into a weedy margin before the asphalt. I could see the faded yellow lines, the sun-bleached pavement, the ordinary geometry of human infrastructure. Safety lay in that strip of road, in its promise of passing cars and witnesses, and the thin veneer of civilization we pretend protects us from darker things. I was 20 yards from the road when my watch buzzed again. Heart rate, 172 BPM, dangerous territory. The kind of spike that preceded cardiac events, that brought runners down on sunny days for no reason medical examiners could later explain. But I still felt fine. Better than fine. I felt electrified. Every nerve firing, every sense sharpened to a point that bordered on painful. I wasn't tired. I was terrified, and my body knew it before my mind could catch up. The sounds in the trees had stopped. I slowed to a walk, scanning the underbrush, trying to locate what had been pacing me. The silence felt deliberate now, weighted with intention. Something was making a choice to be quiet, to hold still, to wait. Then I heard it. An engine approaching from the south, the low rumble of a vehicle moving too fast for the curve of the road. I stepped onto the shoulder just as a sedan came into view, a gray domestic model driven by someone whose face I couldn't see through the glare on the windshield. The car approached my position. I raised my hand in a half wave, a gesture toward normalcy, toward human connection. The driver would see me. We would acknowledge each other. The world would snap back into place. The brakes screamed. The sedan shuddered to a stop 15 feet from where I stood, tires leaving black ribbons on the asphalt. The horn blared once, twice, a sound of alarm and confusion. But the driver wasn't looking at me. They were looking at the road directly in front of their bumper, at the empty space where nothing stood. Nothing I could see, but I felt it. A displacement of air across my face, a pressure wave that carried the smell of wet fur and something deeper, something that triggered memory of childhood fears and ancestral warnings coded into DNA. The presence, whatever it was, had crossed between me and the car, had crossed the road entirely, while remaining invisible to my eyes. The sedan sat there for 3 heartbeats, engine running, brake lights casting red over the pavement. Then the driver gunned it, tires squealing as they accelerated away, leaving me alone on the shoulder with the smell of burned rubber and that other scent, that wrongness, still lingering in the air. I turned back toward the forest. The trees looked different now. The spaces between them seemed deeper, more numerous, as if the woods had quietly rearranged themselves while I wasn't looking. The trail entrance gaped like a mouth, inviting me back into its throat. Complete silence, not even wind. I checked my watch. The data stream showed my heart rate at 142 BPM, elevated but not critical. Normal for someone who'd just witnessed a near accident, whose body was processing adrenaline and confusion. The graph showed the expected spike, the sharp climb as my pulse responded to threat. But when I scrolled back through the timeline, my breath caught. The spike had started 10 seconds before the car appeared. 10 seconds before I'd heard the engine, before I'd stepped onto the shoulder, before anything had happened that should have triggered a physiological response. The graph showed my heart rate jumping from a steady 135 to 172 in a single data point, then beginning to climb even higher, and the timestamp placed it in the final seconds before I'd emerged from the trees. My body had known. Before I'd seen the car, before I'd felt the displacement of air, before any rational stimulus existed, my body had registered the danger and responded. Or something had. I stood on that shoulder for longer than I should have, watching the forest, waiting for some resolution that never came. Eventually, the cold drove me back into motion. I started jogging toward home, taking the road instead of the trail, keeping to the pavement where cars might pass and provide witnesses to whatever came next. Nothing followed me on the road. The run home was ordinary, tedious even, just mile after mile of faded asphalt and rural poverty. Trailers set back from the road, junked cars in yards, the slow collapse of an economy that had moved on and left these places to rot. I'd never been so grateful for human decay, for the proof that people existed out here, that I wasn't alone in some pocket dimension wearing the skin of rural Michigan. But when I got home and synced my watch to the computer, the data told a different story. The route map showed my path out to Route 55, accurate to within a few feet, the red line tracking every turn and straightaway. But the return journey looked wrong. The line flickered and jumped, suggesting I'd teleported through several sections of road, skipping distances that should have taken minutes to cover. My pace showed impossible variations, 4:30 per mile, then 9:15, then 3:45, numbers that made no sense for a steady jog on flat pavement. And the section of trail where I'd heard the footsteps, where I'd been paced by something in the trees, that portion showed a time 3 minutes faster than I'd ever managed. Faster than I could manage, even at a sprint, as if I'd been running from something, or with something, or... I closed the laptop. The house felt too empty that night. I kept the lights on in every room, a wasteful grid of illumination that did nothing to dispel the conviction that I was being watched. Several times I went to the windows, cupping my hands against the glass to peer out into the darkness, half expecting to see something peering back. But there was only my reflection, tired and uncertain, a man who'd run 4 miles and couldn't shake the feeling that he'd brought something home with him. Sleep came late and brought dreams of running, always running, through tunnels of trees that never ended. And in the dreams, I could hear the footsteps keeping pace, that 3-beat rhythm matching my stride, staying just out of sight but never falling behind. When I looked at my watch in the dream, the numbers ran backwards, counting down to something I didn't want to reach. I woke to daylight, and the conviction that I'd dreamed the whole thing. Exhaustion, dehydration, some transient break with reality that exercise could trigger. There were explanations. There were always explanations. But when I went for my next run 3 days later, avoiding the logging trail and sticking to the road, my watch started acting up 2 miles from home. The heart rate monitor spiked to 180 for no reason, held there for exactly 10 seconds, then dropped back to normal. I felt fine the entire time. My breathing stayed steady. My legs kept their rhythm. Everything was ordinary except for the numbers. And in the distance, barely audible over my own footfalls, I heard it. 3 heavy impacts against earth, keeping pace, staying level, matching my speed with perfect precision. I haven't stopped running. Stopping feels dangerous in a way I can't articulate. But every route I take now, every path through every stretch of woods or empty road, generates the same corrupted data, times that don't match my effort, heart rate spikes that precede rather than follow stress, and always, somewhere in the noise of the world, that 3-beat rhythm tracking me. The watch claims I'm getting faster. Each run records better times, shorter miles, impossible paces. Last week I supposedly covered 8 miles in 32 minutes, a pace that would qualify me for the Olympics, that would make me something other than human. I've stopped checking the data. The numbers lie, or they tell a truth I'm not ready to accept. Instead, I just run, and try not to think about what's keeping pace with me. What's been matching my stride since that October afternoon when I saw something that shouldn't exist and felt my body respond to danger before danger arrived. The logging trail is still there, still waiting. Sometimes I drive past it on my way to somewhere else, and I see other runners heading into those trees, their watches tracking their routes, their hearts beating out their simple rhythms. I wonder if they'll feel it too. That moment when the forest goes quiet and something tall and impossible watches from behind a maple tree. I wonder if they'll check their data afterward and see what I see. Evidence that whatever we're running from knows we're coming before we do. That it's been waiting. That it's still waiting. And I wonder, late at night when sleep won't come and the house feels too big around me, if I'm running at all anymore. Or if I'm being pulled, drawn along an invisible string towards something that's been patient, so patient, measuring out the distance 1 3-beat rhythm at a time. My watch is charging on the nightstand. In the darkness, its screen glows with tomorrow's scheduled run. 8 miles, out and back, Route 55 as the turnaround point. The same route I've avoided for weeks. I didn't set that schedule, but I know I'll run it anyway. Because the alternative is to stop, to stand still, to let whatever has been pacing me finally catch up. And my body already knows, the way it knew 10 seconds before the car appeared, that standing still is not an option. It never was. Story 5. The desert doesn't sleep. It waits. I learned that distinction my 3rd week in Nevada, helping old Garrett pull water lines to a livestock trough near the shallow end of Walker Lake. The kind of work city money doesn't prepare you for, but the kind that keeps you from thinking too hard about why you left San Francisco with nothing but a duffel bag and a truck that barely made it past Reno. The night it happened, the air tasted like copper and salt, strange for a place so far from any ocean. But the ancient lake bed held memories in its dust, secrets that predated the cattlemen and the highway, and probably even the Paiute, who knew better than to build anything permanent this close to the water's edge. Garrett had called me around 9, his voice crackling through a connection that seemed to bend and warp with distance, saying the pump housing had cracked and we needed to get it fixed before morning or risk losing the whole herd's water supply. I drove out in my pickup, headlights cutting through darkness so complete it felt textured, like you could reach out and touch the black. The ranch road was barely more than tire ruts through hardpan and sage, winding toward the property's northern edge where Garrett kept his night pasture. The lake sprawled somewhere beyond, invisible except for the way the starlight seemed to stop at a certain point, absorbed by something that gave nothing back. Garrett's truck was already there when I arrived, parked at an angle with its high beams aimed at the trough. He stood beside it, work gloves on, tools laid out on the tailgate. A man in his 70s who moved like the land itself had taught him economy. He raised one hand in greeting but didn't smile. Garrett never smiled much, but that night his face carried something else, a tightness around the eyes that suggested he was listening to something I couldn't yet hear. The work was straightforward enough. Disconnect the old housing, seal the crack with marine epoxy, wait for it to cure. We'd brought battery-powered work lights, but Garrett insisted on leaving his truck's headlights on, aimed not just at our workspace but sweeping out toward the marshy ground between us and the lake. The waste of battery seemed unlike him, but I didn't question it. Not then. About 20 minutes in, while I was holding the housing steady and Garrett was applying the sealant, I became aware of a smell, not the expected sense of mud and livestock and machine oil, but something underneath, organic and wrong, like meat left too long in water that wasn't quite cold enough. I shifted my position, trying to breathe through my mouth, and that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a rock, round, dark, half submerged in the mudflat about 15 feet from where the truck's headlights made their last real stand against the darkness. The kind of smooth stone that water works on over centuries, except this far from any river, it seemed out of place. I stared at it while Garrett worked, some instinct I didn't recognize telling me to keep watching, to mark its position, to not look away. Then it blinked. Not the way a person blinks, with lids that close from top and bottom. This was sideways, a membranous film sliding across from the sides, and in that half-second of movement I saw what I'd mistaken for dark stone was actually an eye, large, amber in the headlight's reflection, with a pupil that wasn't quite round, more like a keyhole turned on its side. My hands went numb. The housing slipped an inch before I caught it, and Garrett made a small sound of irritation, focused on his work, not seeing what I saw. Or maybe he'd already seen it, and that's why he'd positioned the truck the way he had, why his jaw was set like a man expecting bad weather. The thing, I couldn't call it anything else, began to move. Not with the jerky panic of a frightened animal, but with a liquid patience that suggested it had been watching us long before we noticed it. The mud around it seemed to sigh as it pulled itself forward, revealing a body low and broad, skin that looked slick even in the dust, mottled in shades that shifted between brown and gray, and something greenish. The head was too wide, the mouth a lipless gash that stretched nearly the width of its skull. It made no sound. That was what struck me most, the absolute silence of its movement. Even the mud it displaced fell back into place without the wet slap I expected. The creature covered ground with a paddling motion, front appendages that were neither hands nor paws but something in between, digits webbed and splayed, each tipped with what looked like dark nails or maybe small hooves. Garrett set down his brush very carefully. The motion was deliberate, controlled, and when he spoke, his voice was so quiet I almost missed it over the truck's idling engine. Don't move sudden. Don't meet its eyes. But I already had. I'd locked onto that amber gaze and found something looking back that felt ancient and cold and completely alien to anything I understood about Nevada wildlife. Coyotes I'd seen, rattlesnakes plenty, even a mountain lion once from a safe distance. This was nothing that belonged in any taxonomy I knew. It reached the rear wheel of Garrett's truck and stopped. Then, with movements that seemed to unfold rather than execute, it rose up. Not standing exactly, its body remained horizontal, but lifting its front portion like a dog sitting back on its haunches. The appendages came up, those webbed digits gripping the tire's edge, testing it, feeling the weight. The membrane between its fingers caught the light, and I could see veins or arteries branching through, dark against the translucence. The smell intensified. That underwater rot, but also something sharper, almost chemical. My eyes watered and my throat tried to close, and somewhere in my hindbrain, the part that still remembered when humans weren't apex predators, alarm bells were screaming. Garrett moved. Slow, casual, like he was just adjusting his stance. His hand went to the cab of his truck and came back with a rifle I hadn't known was there. He didn't aim it at the creature, just raised the barrel skyward and fired twice in quick succession. The reports cracked across the empty land, echoing off the mountains I couldn't see but knew were there. The thing dropped. Instantly, completely, gone from the tire to the mud in a motion my eyes couldn't follow. By the time I thought to look for where it had been, there was only disturbed earth and a trail of displacement leading back toward the lake. And the mud was moving, not flowing or settling, but rhythmically rising and falling, like something underneath was breathing. We stood there, Garrett and I, frozen in our separate recognitions of what we'd seen. The epoxy was still curing on the housing between us, mundane and necessary and suddenly absurd. After a long moment, Garrett lowered the rifle and said in that same quiet voice, "Best we finish up." We did. Neither of us spoke again until the work was done and we were packing tools, and even then Garrett only said, "Don't come out here at night anymore. Not to this trough." Then he added, softer, almost to himself, "Things that breathe water and earth, you don't mess with them. They were here first and they'll be here after." I wanted to ask what he meant, what he knew, what the hell I'd just seen. But his face had closed like a door, and I understood somehow that asking would be worse than not knowing. So I nodded, loaded my truck, and drove back to the trailer I was renting in Hawthorne, with my hands shaking on the wheel. That should have been the end of it. A strange encounter, the kind of story you tell yourself you'll eventually share but never quite do because you know how it sounds. Desert hallucination, heat exhaustion despite the cool night. Some kind of large toad or salamander species I wasn't familiar with. Perspective and shadow and fear transforming it into something worse. But 3 days later, I found the prints. I'd gone out to move my truck, planning to rotate the tires, basic maintenance. And there on the concrete pad where I parked, clear as day in the morning light, were marks. 5 of them, arranged in a pattern that made my stomach drop. They weren't quite handprints, but they weren't animal tracks either. The shape was wrong, compressed at the center with those radiating digits, and the orientation, they faced backward. Knuckles where palms should be, the pressure points all inverted, like something that walked on the backs of its hands. The concrete was old, cracked, but these impressions were fresh, deep enough that whatever made them had been heavy, or had pressed down with purpose. I knelt beside them, not touching, just looking, and noticed they were damp. Not wet with water, but with something thicker. Something that left a faint residue that caught the light like oil. I looked around. My trailer sat alone on a quarter-acre lot, sage and scrub brush on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor a quarter-mile down the road. Nothing but open space and heat shimmer and that constant Nevada wind that never quite died. No lakes nearby, no water source except my own well. No reason for anything amphibious to be here, 40 miles from where I'd seen it. Except it had been. I knew that with the same certainty I knew my own name. The thing from the trough had followed me home, or tracked me, or somehow knew where I lived. It had come in the night. Last night, the night before, and stood beside my truck, touching it the way it had touched Garrett's, measuring, assessing, claiming. I should have called someone. Sheriff maybe, or animal control, or Garrett himself. But what would I say? And more than that, some instinct told me that involving authorities would only make it worse, would bring attention to something that preferred to remain unacknowledged. Instead, I got a hose and washed away the prints. Scrubbed the concrete until my arms ached and the residue was gone, and I could almost convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Almost. The smell lingered, though, that underwater rot smell, and I found myself checking over my shoulder constantly, scanning the brush line, watching the shadows that didn't quite move right in the peripheral. Nights became difficult. I'd wake at 3, 4 in the morning, convinced I'd heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, too liquid for that, but displacement, the sound of something heavy moving through space it had no business occupying. I'd lie there in the dark, afraid to look out the window, afraid not to, while my heart hammered and my skin prickled with the certainty of being watched. During the day, I'd tell myself I was being ridiculous, paranoid. That stress and isolation were making me see patterns where none existed, transform ordinary night sounds into evidence of stalking. But then I'd find small things out of place. The water bowl I kept outside for strays, bone dry when I knew I'd filled it. Mud smears on my truck's undercarriage that looked almost like handprints. A smell near my door that made me gag. I started keeping the lights on at night. All of them, interior and exterior, my electrical bill be damned. Light meant safety, meant visibility, meant nothing could approach without being seen. Except light also meant I could see out my windows, and sometimes, on the very edge of where the porch light died, I'd catch movement. Something low to the ground, watching, waiting. Garrett called once, asked how I was settling in. I almost told him, came so close to spilling everything, but something in his tone stopped me. He sounded tired, older than his 70-odd years, and when I asked if he'd had any more trouble with the trough, he just said he'd moved it to the south pasture, away from the lake, and left it at that. The silence that followed carried weight. An understanding that some subjects were better left alone. I've started wondering if this is how it happens. Not movie monster attacks or dramatic confrontations, but a slow erosion of certainty. You see something that shouldn't exist, and afterward, nothing feels solid anymore. The rules you thought governed reality start seeming more like suggestions, easily bent by things that know different laws. Last night I woke to find my front door open, just slightly, maybe 3 inches, enough for the desert cold to seep in and raise goosebumps on my arms. I don't remember leaving it unlocked, don't remember opening it, but memory feels slippery lately, unreliable. I got up, crossed the trailer in my bare feet, and as I reached to close it, I looked down. There in the doorway, half in and half out of my home, was a print. Single, fresh, pressed into the threshold with enough force to leave an impression in the metal. The same backward orientation, those webbed digits splayed, and this time I could see the faint texture of the skin that made it. Pebbled, rough, nothing like human, nothing like anything I want to understand. I closed the door, locked it, dead-bolted it, shoved a chair under the knob. Then I sat on my couch with all the lights blazing and waited for dawn, while outside, so faint I might have imagined it, came the sound of mud breathing. I'm still here, still in Nevada, still in this trailer, still doing day work for ranchers who need an extra hand. People ask sometimes if I like it here, if I'll stay. I tell them I don't know yet, that I'm taking it one day at a time. What I don't tell them is that I'm afraid to leave. Afraid that moving would be an admission, a confirmation that something is hunting me. Afraid that wherever I went I'd find prints on my doorstep, smell that rotting water smell. Wake to doors I know I locked standing open. Sometimes I drive out toward Walker Lake, though I never get close. I'll park on a ridge and look out over that ancient, shrinking body of water and wonder what lives in the margins, in the mud and marsh where water meets land and things that shouldn't exist find purchase. I wonder if Garrett knows more than he let on, if there are others who've seen it, if this is just how life works in places too empty for denial. You learn to coexist with the impossible because you have no other choice. The desert doesn't sleep. I understand that now. It watches with amber eyes and moves with amphibian patience and tests the weight of your life with webbed fingers. It knows you're temporary, that everything you build on its surface will eventually sink back into the alkaline mud, that one day you'll stop running and it will still be there, breathing beneath, waiting to reclaim what you borrowed. I just hope I'm gone before it decides to collect. Story 6. Don't stay anywhere without wooden shutters anymore. Not since the Blue Ridge cabin. Not since I heard my own voice calling from the other side of a locked door. The trip was Pritchard's idea. 3 days of fly fishing in October, when the streams ran cold and clear through the Appalachian foothills. Just the three of us. Pritchard, Voss, and me. We'd been doing these autumn escapes for years, ever since college, back when the world felt smaller and safer. The cabin we'd rented sat 2 miles from the nearest paved road, tucked into a hollow where the pines grew so thick that noon felt like twilight. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon, the truck bouncing over ruts and exposed roots until the structure emerged from the trees like something half forgotten. It was older than the listing photos suggested. Rough-hewn logs gone silver with age, a stone chimney leaning slightly to the left, windows that reflected the forest in warped, uneven panes. The porch sagged in the middle. Inside, everything smelled of mildew and old cedar, with undertones of something else I couldn't quite place. Something organic and faintly sweet, like fruit left too long in the sun. That first day passed unremarkably. We unpacked, argued good-naturedly about who got which bunk, and spent the afternoon waist-deep in the stream that cut through the property. The water was so cold it made my teeth ache. Pritchard caught 4 brookies. Voss caught nothing but complained endlessly about his gear. I caught 2 and spent most of my time watching the way light filtered through the canopy, turning everything green and gold and somehow alien. The woods were quiet. Too quiet, Voss joked that evening as we cooked the fish over the wood stove, but he was right, though I didn't want to acknowledge it. No birds. No rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just the constant whisper of wind through pine needles and the occasional creak of the cabin settling around us. The second day, we decided to explore the ridge trail that wound up behind the property. The owner had mentioned it, a 2-hour loop that offered views of the valley below. We set out mid-morning, Pritchard leading with his characteristic confidence, Voss trailing behind with a cigarette dangling from his lips, me in the middle with a backpack full of water and trail mix we'd never eat. The ascent was steeper than expected. The trail, if it could be called that, was barely more than a deer path choked with mountain laurel and fallen logs. The higher we climbed, the thicker the pines grew, their trunks pressing closer together until we had to move single file. The silence followed us. No birdsong, no insects, just our breathing and the crunch of dead needles beneath our boots. Halfway up, Voss stopped to light another cigarette and squinted into the trees to our left. He didn't say anything, but I followed his gaze. There was nothing there, just more pines, their bark black with age, their branches creating a latticework of shadows. But something about the space between those trees felt wrong. Not empty, exactly. More like something had just stepped out of sight. We kept moving. The view from the ridge was worth it, or so we told ourselves. The valley spread out below in waves of crimson and orange, the autumn colors so vivid they looked artificial. We ate our sandwiches and took photos and tried to ignore the way the wind kept shifting direction, bringing with it that same too-sweet smell from the cabin. Voss noticed it too. I saw his nose wrinkle, saw the way his eyes tracked the tree line. We started back down as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. The temperature dropped fast in the mountains. By the time we were halfway down the trail, our breath was visible, small ghosts dissipating in the dimming light. The pines seemed darker now, their shadows longer and more angular. Pritchard picked up the pace. That's when we saw them. 2 points of light, yellowish amber, hovering at chest height maybe 30 yards into the trees. They didn't move, didn't blink, just hung there in the gloom between the trunks, steady and unnatural. We all stopped walking. Pritchard fumbled for his phone, activating the flashlight. The beam lanced through the forest, and for a heartbeat, maybe two, I saw what held those lights. The proportions were wrong, too tall, too narrow, limbs that bent at angles that made my stomach clench. When Pritchard's light hit it full on, the thing didn't recoil or flee like a deer would. It crouched, the legs bent backward, knees reversing, and then it was gone. Not running exactly, more like it folded itself into the shadows, there one moment and absent the next. The only sound was a soft rustling, like fabric dragging across bark. None of us spoke. We walked the rest of the way to the cabin in silence, glancing back every few steps, hands white-knuckled on our phones. The smell followed us down the mountain, that sweet, rotting fruit smell that now made me think of decay, barely hidden under perfume. Back at the cabin, we went through the motions of normalcy, built a fire, opened beers, made jokes about mountain lions and deer, and the tricks low light can play on tired eyes. But the jokes felt hollow, and we kept drifting toward the windows, peering out at the darkening forest. Pritchard checked the locks 3 times. Voss suggested we drive back to town, stay in a motel, come back for our stuff in daylight. Pritchard called him paranoid. I said nothing, just watched the glass reflect our lamplight and wondered what was watching back. We decided to stay. We were grown men after all, rational, educated. We'd all seen stranger things while hiking, probably just a bear or a trick of perspective. The mind fills in patterns where there are none. We knew this. We repeated it like a mantra. By 11, we'd turned in. Pritchard took the main bedroom. Voss and I claimed the bunks in the loft. I lay there staring at the rough ceiling boards, listening to the cabin expand and contract in the cooling air. Every sound felt amplified. The drip of the faucet, the tick of settling wood, Voss's restless shifting in the bunk below. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like slow breathing. I didn't think I'd sleep, but I must have, because I woke to knocking. 3 sharp raps on the front door, then silence, then 3 more. I checked my phone, 12:47 a.m. In the bunk below, Voss was sitting up. I could tell by the creak of the frame. From downstairs, no sound from Pritchard's room. The knocking came again, then a voice. Pritchard's voice, slightly muffled by the door but unmistakable. "Hey, open up. I went out to piss and forgot my key." I started to move, my feet searching for the ladder, but Voss's hand shot up and grabbed my ankle. His fingers were cold, and his grip was iron. He put one finger to his lips and pointed toward Pritchard's door, which I could just see from my angle. It was closed, no light underneath. The voice came again, more insistent now. "Come on, it's freezing out here. Just open the door." It sounded exactly like Pritchard. The same slight gravel in his voice, the same cadence and inflection. But Pritchard was in his room. Had to be. We'd all checked the locks together. No one had left. I climbed down as quietly as I could. Voss and I moved to the railing, looking down at the front door. In the darkness, we could just make out its outline. The knocking resumed, harder now, more urgent. "Guys, this isn't funny. I'm serious, let me in." Voss cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, trying to keep his voice steady. "Pritchard, that you?" Silence. Then from behind Pritchard's bedroom door directly below us, his actual voice, thick with sleep and confusion. "What?" "I'm right here." "What's going on?" The knocking stopped. For maybe 10 seconds there was absolute quiet. No wind, no settling wood, nothing. Then the voice outside spoke again, and my blood turned to ice water. It was my voice. My exact voice, down to the slight rasp I get when I'm tired. "Voss, it's me. I went out the back door to check something. Let me in." But I was standing right there, next to Voss, his face pale in the darkness. Pritchard's door swung open and he stood there in boxers and a t-shirt, looking up at us with wide eyes. The thing outside started knocking again, this time moving along the front of the cabin, from the door toward the window. We could track its progress by sound, knuckles on wood, then knuckles on glass. My voice kept calling, repeating variations of the same plea. "Let me in. It's cold. I'm locked out. Why won't you open the door?" Pritchard grabbed his phone, hands shaking so badly he could barely activate it. No signal. Of course no signal. We were too deep in the hollow. He moved toward the front door, and we both hissed at him to stop, but he shook his head and pressed his eye to the peephole. He jerked back immediately, stumbling over his own feet. When he looked at us, his face had gone the color of old paper. "Nothing," he whispered. "There's nothing there, but I can hear it right on the other side." The knocking intensified, spreading around the cabin now. Front door, side window, back door, another window. It was moving too fast. No person could cover that distance so quickly. And the voices cycled through all three of us, sometimes pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes mimicking conversations we'd had that very day. Then the radio turned on, the old battery-powered AM/FM we'd found in a drawer and used earlier to get a weather report. It sat on the kitchen counter, and now it crackled to life with a burst of static. But instead of a station, we heard ourselves. My voice from the afternoon. "Think we should turn back?" Voss's reply. "Nah, view's supposed to be incredible." Pritchard. "Besides, we're halfway there." The conversation from the ridge replayed perfectly, every inflection and pause an ambient sound. The crunch of our footsteps on the trail. The wind. Even Voss's lighter clicking as he'd lit his cigarette. We stood frozen as it played on, moving through our dinner conversation, our jokes about Voss's fishing luck, my complaint about a blister on my heel. All of it captured somehow, stored somewhere, now being played back to us in the dead of night while something circled the cabin, wearing our voices like masks. Pritchard lunged forward and ripped the batteries out of the radio. The playback stopped mid-sentence. The knocking stopped too. The silence that followed was worse than the noise, thick and expectant, like the cabin was holding its breath. We pulled all the curtains, checked every lock twice, dragged furniture against the doors. Then we sat together in the main room, lights blazing, and waited for dawn. None of us spoke. What was there to say? That we'd all seen the same thing, heard the same thing, that something in these woods could steal voices and faces and play them back like recordings? Around 3 a.m., Voss got up to use the bathroom. On his way back, he stopped at the front window, the one that looked out toward the driveway. He stood there for a long moment, then gestured for us to come look. In the dirt outside, illuminated by the porch light Pritchard had left burning, were footprints. Deep ones, deeper than any human footfall should leave. They came from the tree line, approached the window where Voss stood, and then simply stopped, not turned around, not spread apart as if something had jumped. Just ended. as if whatever made them had ceased to exist mid-stride. Past those prints, at the edge of the light's reach, I thought I saw those amber points again. But when I blinked, they were gone, if they'd been there at all. We left at first light, not even bothering to pack properly. Just threw everything in bags and drove out as fast as the rutted track would allow. None of us looked back. At the rental office in town, I handed over the keys and cited a family emergency. The woman behind the counter took them without question, but something in her expression suggested she'd heard similar stories before. We've never talked about it since. Not really. Voss moved to Colorado 6 months later. Pritchard's calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. I still go hiking, still travel, still camp, but never again without checking the windows first. Never anywhere without solid wooden shutters that can be barred from the inside. Because sometimes, late at night in my apartment in the city, I'll hear my phone's voice assistant activate without being triggered, and it will play back things I said hours before, conversations I've had, complaints I've muttered, jokes I've made to myself. Just little snippets, out of context, at random moments. And I wonder if we really left it behind in those Blue Ridge pines, or if some part of it followed us home, patient and watchful, collecting our words and voices and storing them away for reasons I can't begin to understand. The shutters help me sleep, though. They're solid oak, 3 inches thick, with an iron bar that slots across them from the inside. When they're closed, I can almost convince myself that nothing can get in, almost believe that the reflection I sometimes glimpse in the glass, the one that moves just slightly wrong, that bends at angles that shouldn't be possible, is just a trick of the light. Almost. But I keep the shutters closed anyway. Story 7. The thing about feeding strays is that you never really own them. You're just another stop on their nightly circuit, a reliable source of kibble between whatever else they hunt or scavenge in the sprawling Phoenix suburbs. My roommate and I had been leaving food out for the calico for 3 years, maybe 4. She had a distinctive pattern, a splash of orange over her left eye, black over the right, like someone had painted her face in asymmetrical halves. We never named her. Naming things implies possession, and she wasn't ours to possess. The night it happened, I'd been sorting through boxes in the garage. My ex had finally asked for her things back, which meant confronting 3 years of accumulated memory in cardboard form. Photos mostly. Some letters. A few trinkets that had seemed meaningful once. My roommate suggested burning them in the fire pit out back, said it might be cathartic. He was probably right, though I suspect he just wanted an excuse to use the outdoor fireplace he'd insisted on building last summer. The desert air that October evening carried a peculiar quality, dry and cool, with an undercurrent of something electric. Monsoon season had ended weeks ago, but the atmosphere still felt charged, expectant. We dragged the metal chairs onto the patio, and I fed photographs into the flames one by one, watching faces curl and blacken. My roommate had gone inside to grab more beer, leaving me alone with the fire and the smell of burning glossy paper, which is somehow worse than you'd imagine, chemical and sweet, with an acrid edge that coated the back of my throat. That's when I heard it. 3 distinct knocks on the back door, measured, deliberate. Nothing like the random thump of a branch in the wind or an animal brushing against wood. These were knocks with intention behind them. I turned, and through the glass panel beside the door, I could see her, the calico, sitting perfectly upright on the concrete step, one paw raised as if she'd just finished knocking, which was absurd, obviously. Cats don't knock. But there she was, backlit by the motion sensor light, and something about her posture made my stomach clench. I approached slowly, beer bottle still in hand, and that's when I noticed. The orange splash should have been over her left eye. It was over her right. The black pattern reversed, like looking at her reflection instead of her actual face. I stopped 3 feet from the door, and it tilted its head. Not the quick bird-like movement cats usually make. This was slow, deliberate, mechanical almost. The exact angle I tilt my head when I'm trying to understand something confusing. I'd seen myself do it in mirrors my whole life. My mother had teased me about it since childhood. 43 degrees to the left, chin slightly tucked. The thing that looked like our cat mimicked that gesture perfectly. Its eyes were wrong too. Cat's eyes in the dark show that reflective shine, that alien gleam. These eyes were different, deep and dark and almost matte, absorbing light rather than reflecting it. And the pupils. Too round, too human. They tracked my face with an intelligence that felt observational, analytical. The way you'd study a specimen. The way I'd been studying those photographs before feeding them to the flames. I wanted to step back, to call for my roommate, but my throat had gone dry. The thing, because I couldn't think of it as her anymore, not with that reversed face, continued to stare. It didn't blink. Cats blink. This thing just watched with those bottomless eyes, and I realized I couldn't remember the last time I'd drawn breath. The words came out without conscious thought, some desperate attempt to reclaim normalcy through routine. Come back tomorrow. Our usual phrase when the calico showed up at the wrong time, when we'd already put the food out or were about to leave. Come back tomorrow. Simple, dismissive, safe. The thing took 2 steps backward. Not turning, not shifting position. Just backward, front paws lifting and placing in perfect reverse, like I was watching footage played in rewind. Its eyes never left mine. 2 steps, and then it was at the edge of the patio, where my roommate's grape arbor cast shadows thick enough to hide anything. The motion sensor light flickered once, just once, and it was gone, not running away into the darkness, just gone, as if those shadows had inhaled it. My roommate found me standing at the door, bottle forgotten on the floor where I'd dropped it, amber liquid spreading across tile. He asked if I was okay, and I told him I'd seen a coyote. Not the cat. Not the thing with her reversed face and human eyes. A coyote. Something that made sense in the Phoenix suburbs, where desert and development blurred together. I didn't sleep that night. Lay in bed listening to every sound. The air conditioning cycling on and off. The house settling. The distant highway traffic. And underneath it all, I strained to hear footsteps on the patio. The soft pad of paws, or worse, the measured knock 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 of something that shouldn't know how to knock. The next morning, she appeared. The real one. Orange splash over the left eye, black over the right, patterns exactly as they'd always been. She wound between my legs as I refilled her bowl, purring that rumbling motor sound, and I wanted to feel relieved. Instead, I found myself studying her face, looking for inconsistencies, for any sign that the patterns might shift when I wasn't watching. Her eyes were normal, that clear amber with elliptical pupils, catching the morning light and throwing it back green gold. She blinked at me slowly, the feline gesture of trust, and something in my chest unknotted slightly, but only slightly. I moved her feeding station that afternoon, no longer by the back door where she'd always eaten. Now I put the bowls on the other side of the chain-link fence that separated our yard from the undeveloped lot behind us. The calico seemed confused at first, pacing the fence line, but she adapted. Animals always do. My roommate asked why I'd moved things, and I told him I'd seen rats getting into the food. Another lie. They were coming easier now. I also installed a motion sensor light aimed at the back door, bright enough to flood the entire patio in harsh white LED. My roommate joked about our yard looking like a prison. I told him it was for security. He didn't push it. 3 nights later, I woke to the light blazing outside my window. 2:15 in the morning, according to my phone. I lay there, heart hammering, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray dog. Telling myself a lot of things as I forced my legs out of bed and walked to the window that overlooked the patio. Nothing. The concrete was empty, the door undisturbed, but the light was on, which meant something had triggered the sensor. I watched for 10 minutes, 15, until the light cycled off on its timer. Then I watched the darkness where the arbor crouched, thick with shadow. I thought I saw movement there, something shifting at the boundary between light and dark, but I couldn't be certain. Might have been the wind. Might have been my eyes inventing shapes in the nothing. I started checking on the real cat obsessively. Every morning and evening when she came to the fence for food, I'd study her. The pattern stayed correct. Left eye orange, right eye black. But sometimes when the light hit her a certain way, I'd feel that crawling doubt. Sometimes she'd tilt her head, and I'd wonder if the angle was just slightly wrong, just off enough to make my skin prickle. My roommate noticed I wasn't sleeping well, asked if I wanted to talk about the breakup, if burning the photos had dredged up things better left buried. I appreciated his concern, but how could I explain? How could I tell him that every time I closed my eyes, I saw that reversed face, those absorbing eyes, the mechanical tilt of recognition? How could I describe the certainty I felt that something had been watching me burn those photographs, had seen me destroying connections to the past and had decided to, what? Show itself? Mock me? Replace something? I researched mirror images obsessively, learned that some cultures believe mirrors can trap souls, create doorways, double reality in dangerous ways. Learned about doppelgangers and fetch creatures and shadow selves. None of it helped. All of it made things worse. The rational part of my brain tried to assert itself. I'd been drinking. I was emotionally compromised from the breakup. The smoke from burning photographs, especially old ones with chemical treatments, could cause mild hallucinations. The pattern on a calico cat isn't perfectly symmetrical anyway. I might have just been turned around, confused about which side was which. These explanations made sense. They fit with reality as I understood it. But I kept the light on, kept the food on the other side of the fence, started coming home before dark, not because I had a reason, but because the idea of arriving after sunset, of walking from my car to the back door in the dark, made my hands shake. The real cat, I still thought of her as real, needed to think of her as real, started acting strange. She'd approach the fence for food, then stop several feet away, hackles raised, staring past me toward the house, toward the arbor. Once, she hissed at nothing I could see, then fled into the desert scrub. Didn't come back for 2 days. When she did return, she wouldn't eat unless I stayed there, standing guard, and even then she kept looking over her shoulder. Animals know things. That's what they say, isn't it? Animals sense things humans miss. I wanted to dismiss it as her picking up on my anxiety, reflecting my own fear back at me. But the way she watched that arbor, the way her ears would flatten when shadows moved a certain way, she was afraid of something specific. I thought about cutting down the arbor. My roommate loved that thing, had planted the vines himself, tended them carefully through the brutal summer heat. But those shadows it cast at night, thick and fluid and somehow wrong, made my teeth ache. I'd stand at the window with all the lights on inside, making the glass into a mirror, and I'd watch those shadows, trying to catch movement, trying to prove to myself that nothing was there. But mirrors lie, don't they? Or maybe they tell a truth that's reversed, inverted, the world seen from the wrong side. Maybe that's worse than lying. I stopped going out at night entirely, stopped checking the food bowls after sunset. My roommate started handling the back patio, taking out trash, bringing in mail from the box by the rear gate. He thought I was depressed, grieving the relationship. Let him think that. Better than the alternative. Last week the calico stopped coming. 3 days, 4 days, 5. The food I left went untouched except by ants and the occasional bird. My roommate suggested she'd moved on, found a better territory. Said 3 years was a good run for a stray. But I knew something had changed. On the 6th night, I heard it again. 3 knocks. Measured, deliberate. I was alone in the house, my roommate visiting family out of state. The motion sensor light blazed on, flooding the patio in white glare. I didn't go to the door. Instead, I turned off every light in the house, plunging myself into darkness. Made the windows into true mirrors, reflecting the lit patio back at itself. And there, in that reversed reflection, I could see it sitting on the step. Orange splash over the left eye in the mirror, which meant it was actually on the right. Black where black shouldn't be. those dark, human eyes fixed on my window, on where I stood hidden in shadow. It tilted its head 43 degrees, chin slightly tucked. My gesture, my habit. And then it raised one paw and knocked again. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed through the empty house. I've been keeping all the lights on since then, inside, outside, every fixture burning, every fixture. The electric bill will be astronomical. My roommate returns tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm going to tell him. Don't know how to explain why I've pushed furniture against the back door, why I've stopped looking at mirrors, why I check the cat's food from the front window with binoculars rather than going outside. The thing is, I've been thinking about those photographs I burned, all those faces, all those moments dissolved into ash and smoke. Energy released into the air, matter transformed but not destroyed. My ex used to say I had a habit of erasing things when they became inconvenient, of pretending problems didn't exist if I looked away long enough. Maybe she was right. Maybe something noticed. Maybe something that already lived in reversal, in reflection, in the wrong side of things, saw an opportunity in all that erasure.